Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. As always, we're grateful for the time that we get to connect with you via these webinars. I know I see a lot of familiar names in here, but for those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Anthony, and I am one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we get started, I want to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know of any questions they think would be helpful for the entire group. I also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. Now, in our last webinar, we discussed the volunteer onboarding process and constructing your application. Today, we'll be continuing that idea of information gathering and searching through your volunteer database using attributes. As with our last conversation around this topic, there have been several additions to this area within the last few years, and it's always a good idea to evaluate what data you're collecting since it is your first contact with volunteers and a crucial parameter for engaging that database. There's one attribute we won't be spending any time on today, and that's groups, because that is a separate topic that we'll actually be covering in our webinar next month. And groups are a little bit more involved than the other attributes. So in the interim, if you're looking for more information on groups right now, we do have a playlist of YouTube tutorials on that subject. And we're going to go ahead and send that link to the playlist in the chat here. But for today, we're going to be breaking down the purpose of the other attributes, how they're created, how volunteers can engage this information, and what you can do with this collected information. Now, there are actually a few disparate types of attributes, so we'll be talking about them in 3 different sets. And the first set of attributes is interest categories, skills, equipment, and availability. Now, interest categories do differ from skills, equipment, and availability, in that they are also utilized to categorize your events. And arguably, that's actually the primary function of interest categories because it can lead directly into reporting or searching for events, either from the admin perspective or the volunteer perspective. And you can even use interest categories to host your events online separately. But they can also be used to collect information from volunteers, which makes them pretty similar to the other 3 attributes. And that's kind of what we'll be focusing on today. We do have several resources on the topic of interest categories and kind of how they relate to event categorization. So if you do have questions about that, please feel free to ask those. But again, today we're going to be focusing more on sort of the volunteer collection or the data collection side of interest categories. So with all 4 of these attributes, the way they're presented to volunteers and kind of how you're collecting information via those is on the direct application itself. So you can choose to have these attributes on your application. You do not, and by default, they are disabled. But if you choose to have them on your application, they'll show up as checklist fields. Someone can go through and select as many items as they want to indicate, again, what they're interested in or what skills they might have or their general availability, potentially like what equipment they might bring to an event. But what these are, the way they're presented to volunteers is just kind of a set of information that they can then go and select through and add those to their profile. Now, what's being collected is totally up to you in terms of what information is actually a part of those attributes. Of course, interest categories, you're going to develop those yourself. Now, typically these represent things like programs or departments or potentially locations or sites. If you have, maybe multi-site kind of interactions or different places for volunteers to engage with you. So your interest categories might represent something like that. Skills could be exactly that. What types of skills volunteers might have that you are looking for. But again, you develop this content yourself, so you can create kind of whatever information in here you'd like to. And that's, of course, true for the other 2 attributes, equipment and availability. Now, I often use equipment in a couple different capacities or examples. One might be if someone is bringing equipment to an event and you want to be able to identify like who has the capacity to bring a pickup truck to an event. You could use equipment to track that type of data. But you can also use equipment to track what things you are lending out or checking out to volunteers. Now that's actually the way that I'm using this inventory right now in our demo console. This is not a part of the application. Volunteers cannot self-select this data. But if I lend out a piece of equipment to someone, then I can go to that person's profile. So go to the volunteer database, locate the individual that I lent the equipment to, go into manage their profile. And then under kind of the third section of their account, there's this view or update equipment. All the attributes are kind of housed in here. But if I go into equipment, I could say, okay, this person's borrowing a lawnmower, and more specifically, this is number 13. And then I could add that to their profile. This is not something volunteers can engage because I don't have it turned on for them at the moment. But I can see this. I can run searches on this. And then when they return this, I could go in and remove it from their profile, maybe add a note to their profile as well. But that way I can kind of readily search by, who has what type of equipment currently lent out. So you can use that in different capacities. That one's a little bit unique as well. And then availability is just exactly that, general availability of volunteers. Now, actually, skills, equipment, and availability can be renamed. All three of those are controlled in the system configuration. So under system management, go into edit system configuration, and then under system settings, you can retitle what those attributes are. There's a singular and plural column for each of those. So if you do change it, make sure you change both. They don't necessarily have to be different if that doesn't necessarily make sense. But there is a way for you to do that if you need to. So yeah, if you want to track something entirely differently, like maybe you don't care about equipment at all, but you do really care about what languages your volunteers can speak, well, then you could change the name of that attribute to language and languages. And then you could use that to track, what languages your volunteers are fluent in or can read and write or whatever. So kind of once you've decided what you're collecting using this information, you need to, of course, construct that. It's different based on whether you're doing interest categories or the skills, equipment, availability, but they're all relatively similar. So I'll just briefly show you. And again, we have more resources on the nitty gritty of creating this information, especially with interest categories. But like for interest categories, you identify the name of the category. You identify a contact person, which this can be used for notifications, but it does not have to. By default, that notification is not turned on. But this could just be you. You could list yourself as the contact for every category. Your volunteers don't see this. And then a parent category allows you to create sort of these nested relationships. So like I have a list of programs in my system. So I have those all listed out here: admin office, community outreach, library, mentorship, warehouse. Those are all of our programs. And then some of those have subcategories as well, right? So like library has several subcategories, and even one of those has its own subcategories. So you can get pretty deep on those. But that's the purpose of the parent category. So for example, if I was to make a new program, then of course I would just give it a title. And then I would select as the parent category programs. And that way it'll fit neatly underneath that and get sorted alphabetically amongst the others at that level. The selectability here is pretty important as well. You'll almost always want to do enabled for that. That means you can utilize the category. If you're creating something that's purely a heading, like for example, this programs heading, then I've disabled that because I don't ever want someone to select that category. You can tell by the color of this icon here. And if you mouse over it, it says disabled, but that just means that this is not selectable. And if we go and look at the volunteer's profile, if we go to create an account or on the application itself, you would see that there's no checkbox next to that item. Otherwise, that should generally be enabled because that's how you actually utilize that category. Okay, so that's interest categories. And then the other three attributes are relatively straightforward, and these three are all pretty much the same. So we'll look at skills. If we go into the skills inventory and open this up, you can again create anything in here. If you're creating this for the first time, it's going to be blank. If you need an idea list, we do have an example list on our support tool. So you can use that need help button, search for skills, and you'll find that document. But you can see here that there's only three pieces of information when you're adding in a new item. You have the skill code, you have the skill name, and then you have a description. Now, the description is only visible on the back end, so I wouldn't spend too much effort on that. Your volunteers can't see that. You'll want the name itself to be relatively descriptive. But the code is what you can use to sort this inventory. It's a 4-digit number, and the system will use that to sort the inventory based on the way that you've structured it. You can tell the system to ignore the code and sort alphabetically. That's a setting in the system configuration under information collection. But really all you're doing in here is creating, a set of skills that you want volunteers to be able to self-select. And this is kind of true of all 4 of these attributes. Replace the word skill with equipment or availability. You're creating an inventory that you want volunteers to be able to self-select from. So they're identifying this information, and then you can utilize that data to run searches or to run reports. You can use that to send out blast emails. It's really just a way for you to collect another layer of information that you can utilize in, some reporting or searching mechanics. So for example, if we go and look at my skills inventory, I'm collecting some language information in here. I've sort of created these headings within here. You might have noticed that. These are not true headings in the same way that you'll see in the interest categories. There's no nested relationships here. I just chose to use formatting when I created those inventory items to make them look like they had authority. And then the inventory items underneath those, I used dashes to make them look like they were sort of underneath that. So if I wanted to add a new one in there, for example, just add a skill code, create the name, and then add that inventory item in. But you can see here, all of these items have to the left of them some searching options. So let's say, for example, I do need some volunteers this weekend who can speak Spanish. Well, I can go and actually search for all my volunteers who have identified that they have the ability to speak Spanish. So I can go in here and click on full search. That will open up a list of any individual in my system who has that skill on their profile. From there, I could select the results, send an email, create a printout if I want to. I could even use these results to inform a report. If we go into the report management section, I can use my custom participation report and say, use my previous volunteer search. And so only those individuals will show up in this report. So again, just like with any search that you might run in CERVIS, there's a number of things that you can do once you've run that search. But that search can be run directly through the attribute itself using this search icon here. I use the full search option. There's 2 others though. There's an only search and a null search. The only search will show you people who only have this skill and no other skills selected. And then the null search will show you any person who does not have this skill selected. They could have anything else selected, but they specifically do not have this one. So you can run those searches through here, but you can also choose to run other types of searches. For example, if I want to see volunteers who have any other language selected other than English, then I could select all of those. And then down here, I could say show volunteers with selected skill. And then I can also run the same types of searches in the advanced volunteer search. So from the volunteer database side of the system, go into advanced volunteer search. From here, you'll see all of your attributes are listed out separately. So I can go into my skills section. I can select, again, Spanish in here, and then I could run a search for that. The nice thing about doing this through the advanced volunteer search is that, of course, you can also combine this with other things. Like let's say, for example, this event is happening on a Friday, and I specifically want to find people who can speak Spanish and are generally available on Fridays. Well, I can open up that section and click on Friday here. And now I'm sort of narrowing my result to people who are more likely to fit my need. All right, so that's basically how these 3 or 4 attributes function. You're gathering information from volunteers that you can use to run searches, which can influence emails that you send out, or potentially different types of reports that you might run as well. So the next attribute is checklist items, which are a different type of attribute. These allow you to keep track of dated tasks or requirements for volunteers. They don't allow the same type of interaction from volunteers. So volunteers can potentially see these on their profile, but they cannot make changes to them. They're generally used to track things like mandatory trainings or orientations, required certifications, or documents that you need to be turned in or evaluated, or really any type of dated requirement where you'd like to identify either a date that the checklist item was completed or potentially also a date when the checklist item will expire. So that's kind of what differentiates checklist items from the other attributes. Again, they're not something that volunteers are directly engaging with per se. They can potentially see this on their profile, but they're not going to be making changes to that directly. But really the main difference is that they've got those dates attached to them as well. So you can identify like when something was completed, when it's going to expire. And then, of course, you can run searches on that whole metric of data as well. And then you can also use checklist items to set restrictions on your events. This is unlike the other 4 attributes that we just talked about. You cannot use restrictions based on someone's skill sets or equipment or things like that. But with checklist items, you can. So you can set a restriction saying that volunteers can only sign up if they have completed this checklist item on their profile and it is not expired. So to create a checklist item is going to be the same sort of idea. This is done through the attribute management section. Go into checklist item inventory management, which is where we are currently. At the top of the page, you can generate those checklist items. So you give it a name, give it a description. Auto assign is something you would use if every person needs to complete this. Then when someone creates a new profile, this is marked as assigned to their account, and it will be marked as due within a certain number of days, depending on what you select in here as the due date. Now, this is sort of an arbitrary metric in a sense. It's really just a way for you to search for this information. You can find people who are overdue on a certain item, but it's not going to be sending out notifications to the volunteers themselves because, again, they can't necessarily make changes to this checklist item. They can see the status on their profile, but they can't necessarily make changes to it. So there's a couple other items in here too. You have the checklist item type, which is either private or public. If this is a public checklist item, then volunteers can see it on their profile. And again, they can't make changes to it, but they can see the statuses. If it's private, they're not aware at all that this is a part of their account, but you're tracking it on the back end, which is where you're going to be running those searches and setting requirements and things like that anyway. The final thing you can do with a checklist item is link an award. This is a newer setting for checklist items. It was added, of course, after awards were added. But if you set up a manual award that's associated with a checklist item, like completing a certain intake process, returning some documentation to you, becoming certified in some manner, you could link that to an award so that when this checklist item gets marked as complete on someone's profile, they would also automatically receive that award for being a driver or something else. So this is just the inventory where you create and manage existing checklist items, but where you actually engage the data itself is going to be through volunteer profiles. So if we go back to the volunteer database side, and we'll go back to the example I was using previously, Annie Bell, I'm going to go into manage her profile. And if we scroll down, you can see, of course, there's a section for checklist items. And if I open this up, I can see what the status is for this individual, within the checklist items that I have created currently, which is 3 of those. So we can see in this case, she's overdue on her intake form. That was actually due in July of last year. She's completed her safety training, and we can see when it's set to expire. And she's never done her TB test. It hasn't been assigned to her. Now, of course, these can represent any number of different things. Kind of mentioned that earlier, but if you're having questions about kind of like what types of examples, go ahead and ask that and we can share some more. But you can see here that if, like, let's say she did complete her intake form finally, then I could come in here and I could mark this as completed. Now, by default, the system will choose today's date as the date completed, but I can backlog that. So if she did actually do this in July of last year, I could go back, and say it was completed then. But we can choose a date here, or we can leave it blank. We can also choose an expiration date or leave that blank as well. If this is going to expire, like you'll have to redo this form every 5 years or something, then I could go ahead and set an expiration date 5 years in the future. Or you can leave that blank if there is no expiration date. And then you can also add notes to checklist items. So if you need to indicate more information about how this was completed or other data tied to this, you could add notes to that as well. So this is where you'll be doing the most engagement in terms of managing checklist items. It's going to be done on the volunteer basis. That said, you can do bulk actions with those as well. So if we go back to the volunteer dashboard, and if I just ran a search for a subset of volunteers that completed their orientation or their onboarding, I could select all those individuals and then do a bulk update here. And then I could choose to bulk update a specific checklist item. So I'll go into volunteer checklist items. And then from there, I could select which item I want to update. So maybe they all finished their safety training. I could mark it as completed, when it was completed. So all those same fields exist in here, and I can do that in bulk as well. One last thing I want to point out in terms of engaging the checklist items themselves is that you'll notice once you create a checklist item, you will see a quick action for that when you're engaging your volunteer dashboard. So each person will have this manage checklist items action appear once you have created a checklist item. So of course, like with the other attributes, you can run searches based on checklist items. If we go into the advanced search, we can check out that section. So you can go into checklist options. You can select a particular checklist item and you could run a search based on one of the dates associated with it. So if it is or was due between certain dates, if it is or was completed between certain dates, if the date of completion is greater than a certain number of months old. So you can run searches based on any of those sorts of things. And again, that can be used in conjunction with other items if you need to kind of create a larger subset or a smaller subset of individuals. So you can run searches based on that, which again is going to lead you to the same sort of actions that we saw previously. You can send emails, you can create reports or printouts. Any of those types of things exist as well. But checklist items also have one other interaction that your other attributes do not have, and that is creating restrictions on opportunities. So when you create an opportunity in Service, you have the ability to, under the registration restriction options, set one of your checklist items as a restriction. If you select one of those within here, it means that the volunteer has to have this marked as completed on their profile in order to be registered for this opportunity. So if it's assigned but not yet completed, if it's due or overdue, if it's expired, none of those things would allow someone to register. They would have to have this item marked as completed on their account in order for them to be able to register for this opportunity. So that's unique amongst the attributes. Checklist items can be used as restrictions, whereas the other attributes cannot. So one final thing that's also unique to checklist items is there is a report designed specifically for checklist items. So if we go into volunteer management, report management, and we scroll down, the report number 9 is the checklist status report. It's a spreadsheet, so it's kind of like a data export, but you can choose which of your checklist items you'd like to include alongside other volunteer information. So this will include, if you do like high detail, it's going to have basically all of the information from the checklist. So when it was completed, when it was due, expired, all that kind of information, the status, of course. So you'll see all that sort of data. And you can also use queries to influence this report. So if you want to view this for everyone, that's the default. But you could also run a search for a subset of volunteers and then use that previous search as the query. You can think of this as like a data export that also includes checklist status information. All right, so the last attribute we're going to be looking at here today is awards, which are a newer addition to Service, and they represent a very different type of attribute. These are generally what you might consider an incentive for volunteers. You might refer to it maybe even as a cosmetic because it shows up as a badge on their profile. They can be implemented to automatically award volunteers with badges based on hours or times of attendance or even impact tracking metrics that you've established. They can also be awarded manually to volunteers based on other interactions you've had with them, maybe that are above and beyond, or like we mentioned earlier, you might have a checklist item that would trigger an award, like if they've been certified or they're a driver or something, you could have those awards handed out based on, what you've created and then other associations within the system. So again, they're a little bit different in terms of how they're set up. You are creating, in this instance, the awards themselves. And you're choosing essentially how they're awarded to volunteers. And then, of course, we can go and look at on a volunteer's profile how they might receive those. Now, of course, volunteers can't self-select to add these to their profile. So that's kind of similar to checklist items in that regard. Once you've established an award, it's either going to be automatically assigned to volunteers once they achieve those goals, or you can manually assign them to volunteers in different instances. To create an award in here, you'll do so at the top of the page. Just enter in the name of the award, enter in a description for that award. We have kind of an example in gray text here. Below that, you can choose what badge you want to assign to the award. There's a number of options in here. You can reuse these. So if you want to use the same badge for multiple things, that's fine. And then the award assignment determines how someone receives this award, basically how it's given to them or attributed to them. So this is where you create the automatic assignments. As well as if you want to make this a manual award, just select manual on the right-hand side and you can leave the rest as is. Then this will only be given to volunteers when you choose to do so. Or again, if you link them to like a checklist item, there's a few other places you can link them as well. But if you do want these to be automatically assigned based on like the number of times or hours that someone has operated with you, you can set up the award assignment to do so. So you can say, I want to assign this award for anyone who completes 15 hours within a month. So you can say 15 hours monthly. This award will then be given to volunteers once a month if they achieve that 15-hour goal. So you can have time periods associated with these, monthly or yearly, but you can also do lifetime attributes. So if they achieve 15 hours total over the course of time working with you, you can give an award for that. And then you can also do numbers of years of service. So that's another sort of metric that you can apply an award for. Now, as with all other attributes, this inventory will be blank when you initially enter the screen. So you won't see any examples in here. This is our demonstration console. We do have these examples available in a document if you want to look through those. But you can see these are sorted out by the types of milestones that they are. The system does that automatically based on how you establish the award. So years of service, lifetime participation, like lifetime hours or lifetime instances of working with you. So like how many times they worked with you, which is the number of registrations. You can also see there's yearly participation, monthly participation, and then manually assigned awards will fall under this other category. So there's a lot of things that you can do through here in terms of generating these awards. And then, like I said, they'll either be assigned automatically once someone achieves whatever the goal is. I do want to mention there is a 48-hour buffer period on these awards being assigned to volunteers. So for example, if someone just achieved 50 lifetime hours today, they signed out and they got that 50th hour, the system will not give them that award until 2 days later. It gives you margin to mark no-shows if you need to, or adjust hours. So if someone actually didn't achieve that, they no-showed for an opportunity that was worth 10 hours or something, you could prevent them from receiving that award by marking them as a no-show. But when a volunteer does receive an award, that'll show up on their profile. I'm going to switch to the volunteer perspective here. In this profile icon at the top, you can view as a volunteer. So even though I am an admin in the system, this is kind of a handy trick. You can view the system as a volunteer access level if you want to. But when you switch over to that, you can see if I have recently earned an award and haven't yet noticed that, I'll have this banner at the top of the page here, and that'll tell me kind of what the award is and any descriptions with that. And if I click on that, that'll also take me to my award history, which is kind of like a trophy case. This will show you any awards you've earned in the past. And then it'll also show you awards that you are on the way toward earning and sort of how much progress you've made toward those awards. The other place where these badges will show up is when a volunteer is logging into their account. They'll see that badge over their icon when they're logging in. Again, these are primarily designed as an incentive or sort of like a cosmetic for volunteer profiles to incentivize them to do certain things. But you can also run some pretty interesting searches using awards, which again can lead into reporting or emails or anything like that. So if we go over to the advanced volunteer search under volunteer management, and we scroll down, there's an award options section, and you can find volunteers that earned a certain award. So that's pretty straightforward, people who've served 1 year, something like that. But you can also find individuals who earned that award within a certain time frame. So maybe I want to find people who've earned 200 lifetime hours, but I don't want to see everyone. I only want to see people who achieved that this month. So I could actually set a date range for that. And now I'm looking for individuals who reached their 200-hour marker within the last 20 days or since the start of this month. So that can be a relatively interesting search. Other than that, of course, you can just find people who have a certain award. And then just like with any of the other searches, you can use that to create printouts, send emails, run reports if you want to go from that aspect. So there's a number of things you can do from there. I know we kind of briefly went through awards and checklist items. I do want to mention that we have done webinars in the past on those two topics specifically, which are much more in depth. As with any of our past recorded webinars, those are available on our YouTube channel, and you can go and review those as you need to. Today, we did cover an overview of kind of the attribute side of service. We discussed how to set up and generate those attributes in order to collect more information from volunteers or on behalf of your volunteers. And then we also discussed how each attribute can be used to produce engagements with your volunteer database and sort of what that can do for you on the back end. So we're going to move into a time of Q&A. I know our team has been answering questions throughout the call, but I'll be taking your questions for the larger group as they come in. So please feel free to continue writing those in. As we're moving into that time, I also want to mention that if you do have additional questions on different topics, you can always use our customer support team to engage them directly. So when you're logged in to your account, if you click on Need Help at the bottom of the page, that'll bring up this dialog. You can type in a topic. So we talked today, about awards, different things like that. You could search for that term through here, see what articles have to do with that. A lot of those articles have videos attached to them as well. But if you click on Contact Us at the bottom, you can always submit a support request. So just write in your question through here, click on Send, and then our customer support team will get back to you shortly. We have posted hours of Monday through Saturday, 8:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So if you submit a question within those hours, you can typically expect a response within 30 minutes to an hour. They're very prompt. Okay. One last thing too to mention regarding awards. Wanted to mention that there is a specific report for awards. So under volunteer management, go into report management. This is very similar to kind of like the checklist report. If we scroll down right below that, there's an award recipient report as well. So if you want to select, who has certain awards and view that as a report format, you can do so through here. Okay, and it looks like our team has answered essentially all the questions as they've come in. So if you do have more questions, again, feel free to use our customer support tool. And as I mentioned, the recordings for previous webinars are available on our YouTube channel as well. You can just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies, or if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you directly to that channel as well. All right, so once again, I just want to thank you for your time today. As always, it's a pleasure to see you in the chat. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so thank you for joining. We as a team are grateful for the work that you do throughout all the different organizations and communities that you're serving and impacting. And partnering with you is one of the most satisfying aspects of our work. Again, if you have any questions from the content today, or just utilizing your system in general, use that support tool. Contact support at servicetech.com, or again, any of those previous recordings as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.